I still remember the first time we saw the house. Its peeling paint and windows with glass thick enough to ripple the sunlight. There was a strange allure to it, something that pulled me in despite its neglected facade. A little work and it'll be perfect, I told my husband, Tom, brushing off the peculiar tension I'd felt as soon as we crossed the threshold. He, ever the practical one, raised an eyebrow at me, but we signed the papers anyway. The first few weeks were full of settling in, a whirlwind of boxes, dust, and that peculiar satisfaction of arranging things just so. But before long, the signs began, small at first, almost trivial. I noticed things like a hairbrush moved to the other side of the bathroom, a book opened to the wrong page. Little details that I brushed off with a shrug, assuming they were my own absent-minded errors. Then, one evening as I was cooking, a dull sound reverberated from below. It was as if something had shifted in the basement, scraping across the concrete floor. Tom was away on a business trip, and I was alone in the kitchen, staring down at the knife in my hand, wondering if I truly heard it. I called out instinctively, though I knew no one else was in the house. "Hello?" Silence replied, stretching around me like a taunt. The sound was gone, and, chalking it up to old pipes, I pushed it from my mind. But as I was washing up later, I felt a curious sense of being watched, like there was something unseen standing just at the edge of my vision, waiting. The next day, I decided to inspect the basement. I took a flashlight with me, though the dim light of the single bulb was enough to illuminate the stairs and a cramped space where various forgotten objects lay scattered. Dust floated in the air, catching in the light like tiny, quiet witnesses. Nothing appeared out of place until I saw an old, unmarked box wedged under the staircase. Inside, a tangle of papers and old photographs lay dormant, worn with age. One photograph in particular caught my attention. A portrait of a stern-looking man with dark eyes that seemed to follow me, almost as if he recognized something in me. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it left an impression. As the days went by, the disturbances grew more frequent. Doors would swing shut of their own accord, and once I returned home to find the living room rug folded neatly at the corners, as if someone had meticulously straightened it. I began to feel an eerie familiarity in these actions, as though the house itself had learned my habits and routines and was now toying with them. I confided in Tom, but he laughed, attributing it all to the quirks of an old house. He didn't understand, though, how unsettling it was to feel my space slowly being taken over by an invisible presence, an unknown hand that seemed intent on disrupting my sense of order. One night, as I lay in bed unable to sleep, I heard it again. The scraping sound from the basement, sharper this time, more insistent. It echoed up the staircase, as though something was trying to claw its way toward me. My breath stilled, and I lay there, wide-eyed, staring into the darkness. I realized, then, that this wasn't just the house settling or some trick of my imagination. Whatever had been lying dormant in that basement was waking up. And for reasons I couldn't yet understand, it felt personal, almost as though it had been waiting for me. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house seemed to thicken, clinging to me like a damp shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a space that somehow knew me, anticipated me. Small disturbances continued. A vase tilted slightly off-center, a cup that had mysteriously emptied itself of water overnight. Little things that, one by one, were easy to dismiss but, taken together, painted an unnerving pattern. Then the footsteps began. It was early morning when I first heard them, faint but unmistakable, like someone walking on the floorboards in the basement beneath me. I paused mid-sip of coffee, the warmth of the mug contrasting sharply with the chill spreading through my chest. The footsteps were soft but steady, tracing a careful, deliberate path. I strained to listen, half expecting them to stop as soon as I acknowledged them. But they continued, one step at a time, as though they had a purpose. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that it had to be some animal trapped below, but a sliver of doubt lodged itself in my mind. That evening, as I stood at the top of the basement stairs with a flashlight in hand, I was seized by a peculiar feeling. One part dread, one part compulsion. I had to see what lay beneath. The stairs creaked with each step, amplifying my unease, until I reached the bottom. The basement smelled of damp stone and something else, a faint hint of something metallic, almost sour. I scanned the room with my flashlight, lingering on each corner, but everything was as it should be. Tools hung neatly on the wall, a stack of old crates by the far end, and that box of photographs under the stairs. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, but I could feel it, the presence of something old and patient, lingering just beyond the reach of the light. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. The photographs in the box had been rearranged, fanned out as if someone had sifted through them. At the top of the pile was the same portrait of the dark-eyed man, his face now worn and cracked with age. This time, though, I felt a distinct sense of recognition, as if the man were looking back at me with a quiet accusation. I set the picture aside, refusing to let my mind wander into the strange connection I felt to it, and turned to head back upstairs. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint it could have been mistaken for a breath. It seemed to come from behind me, near the shadows at the edge of the basement. I turned sharply, my flashlight slicing through the darkness, but nothing appeared out of place. Back upstairs, I did my best to dismiss the experience, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. But that night, lying in bed with the house steeped in silence, I couldn't shake the impression that I had disturbed something in that basement, something that was quietly waiting, watching. For the first time, the house no longer felt like my own. A few days later, a friend from town mentioned an old rumor about the house. "You know, some people say it's haunted," she said with a nervous chuckle. She leaned in, her eyes widening. "They say the original owner was, well, troubled, that he claimed to hear voices and see things no one else could." I laughed it off politely, but the words clung to me, echoing in my mind as I went about my day. I tried to dismiss them, but something had already taken root, a gnawing curiosity that I couldn't ignore. That night, I went back down to the basement, the flashlight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. And there it was again, the faint, deliberate sound of footsteps pacing slowly beneath me, as if someone were rehearsing a memory of a place they had once belonged. This time, I listened, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. As the steps faded, a single thought struck me with a chilling clarity. Whatever was in this house was not finished with me. It had waited long enough, and now it wanted something I wasn't sure I could give. In the days that followed, the disturbances grew bolder, as if the house had grown tired of my reluctance to acknowledge it. Objects began to vanish with unsettling regularity. Keys I just set down on the table would be gone when I turned back. My reading glasses would disappear, only to reappear hours later in a different room entirely. Each time, the feeling that I was no longer alone in my own home pressed down on me a bit harder. It was Tom who noticed the scratches on the basement door. They were faint but unmistakable, thin lines carved into the wood just above the handle as though something or someone had clawed at it, desperate to get in or out. He looked at me with a mix of concern and exasperation. "Anna, you've been worrying over nothing. It's probably just an old lock scraping against the door," he said, dismissing it with the same ease he'd dismissed every other strange occurrence. But I could tell he was bothered. I could see it in the way his hand lingered on the doorknob, his eyes narrowing as he traced the marks with his fingers. He didn't want to admit it, but something about that basement was beginning to trouble him too. One evening, after he'd gone to bed, I decided to confront the space once and for all. Armed with a notebook and the flashlight, I made my way down, determined to catalog every corner, every inch, as if that could somehow give me control over whatever was haunting us. I started by jotting down details about the boxes, the tools, the cracked cement floor, all ordinary things made sinister by the silence that wrapped around me. Halfway through my notes, I felt an odd pressure in the room, a thick, palpable tension. I heard the faintest shuffle, like the brush of fabric against skin, and then silence. The flashlight flickered briefly, casting a jittery light over the walls, illuminating the boxes and that photograph of the dark-eyed man. I took a steadying breath and continued, determined not to let fear get the better of me. But when I returned to the top of the stairs, I found the basement door closed, locked. I twisted the knob, but it refused to budge. Panic surged, my fingers slipping over the smooth metal as I pounded against the wood. "Tom," I called, my voice echoing in the confined space. The house answered with silence, thick and consuming. My heart raced, a trapped bird fluttering against my ribs as I called out again, louder this time, praying he would hear me from the bedroom above. After a few moments that felt like hours, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open, revealing Tom's puzzled face on the other side. "What on earth are you doing down here?" he asked, his eyes searching mine with a look I couldn't quite place. Part irritation, part something else, a quiet unease that mirrored my own. The door was locked, I stammered, feeling foolish but shaken. I couldn't get it open. He frowned but said nothing, instead giving the basement one last look before turning back toward the bedroom. I followed, each step heavier than the last, the sensation of the basement clinging to me like a cold shadow. That night, as I lay beside him, I could swear I heard the faintest of sounds beneath us, the shuffle of footsteps, and then, in a whisper I could barely make out, my name. "Anna." The next day, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I spent hours at the local library, combing through old records, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the restless presence in our home. Finally, buried in the back of an old registry book, I found a single, chilling entry, a record of the previous owner, a man named Samuel Blackwood. The note was brief but telling, a description of increasing isolation and disturbing behavior, ending abruptly with the simple phrase, "disappeared without a trace." I stared at the words, my pulse pounding. Disappeared. Had he simply left? Or had he, too, become ensnared in the strange, suffocating atmosphere of that basement? It was a question I didn't want to answer, but as I closed the book, I felt a certainty settle over me. Whatever had happened to Samuel, whatever had caused his sudden departure, it was still in that basement, waiting for me. As I left the library, a cold realization settled in. The house wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was something darker, something patient, and it wasn't going to let go of me so easily. After my discovery about Samuel Blackwood, I found myself watching the house in a new, fearful way. The silence between the walls felt charged, as if it were hiding a secret it knew I'd uncovered. Every object seemed to pulse with an intent I hadn't noticed before, and every creak of the floorboards carried an almost conspiratorial tone. It was as if the house had known I'd eventually go looking for answers. Tom was less than thrilled about my late-night research. He sat me down one morning over breakfast, his face tight with concern, his voice carrying an edge that barely hid his frustration. "Anna, you're letting this place get to you. There's no haunting, no lost souls in the basement. It's just an old house with a bit of character." He tried to laugh, but the sound died, stifled by the stillness between us. I forced a smile and nodded, but a part of me felt numb, cold. He hadn't heard his name whispered in the dark. He hadn't seen the flicker of movement at the corner of his eye, nor the strange scratches reappearing on the basement door. He hadn't felt the weight of that basement's presence, like something watching from a hidden place, waiting for me alone. It was just after midnight when the quiet became unbearable. Tom was fast asleep beside me, his breathing steady, blissfully unaware of the dread that clung to the house. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and padded softly toward the basement door. It loomed in the dim hallway, a shadowed barrier between me and whatever lay below. As I opened it, a rush of stale, cold air washed over me. The basement seemed darker than before, the light bulb casting a weaker glow, barely illuminating the steps below. I hesitated, feeling that familiar pressure in the air, as though something were crowding close, filling the space with an unseen presence. It seemed to sense my approach, waiting, and I felt an odd pull, a need to descend those stairs, as if compelled by something beyond my own will. The first step was hard, but each step after that felt easier, smoother, as if the house were somehow guiding me down. My feet hit the cement floor, and I paused, taking in the dim outlines of boxes, the dusty shelves. But there, to my left, something had changed. The photograph of the dark-eyed man, the one that had been tucked away in the corner, was now propped upright on a box, facing the stairs, as though it had been waiting for me. A shiver ran through me, but I forced myself closer, studying his face in the dim light. There was something unsettling about his gaze, an intensity one hadn't noticed before. His eyes seemed to follow me, holding a strange, almost knowing expression. It was as if he knew exactly why I was there, exactly what I feared. I reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the edge of the frame. As my fingers brushed the glass, a sound echoed through the basement, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere deeper in the shadows. My heart raced, and I pulled my hand back, the photograph now looking distorted in the low light, his features blurred, as though he'd shifted beneath my gaze. I turned, scanning the dark corners, searching for the source of the sound. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like knuckles rapping on wood. It was coming from the far wall, where the shadows clung the thickest. Slowly, I stepped toward it, each movement feeling like a descent into something far darker, far older than the house itself. Then, with a jolt, I realized what it was. The tapping was coming from behind the wall itself. It took a moment for me to process it, to accept the impossible sound. My hand reached out almost involuntarily, fingers tracing the rough surface of the wall. The tapping stopped instantly, and the silence that followed was absolute, pressing down on me like a weight. I stood there, frozen, waiting. Part of me wanted to run, to flee up the stairs and out of that suffocating darkness, but another part, a darker, more curious part, kept me rooted in place. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I could feel it, hovering just out of sight, a presence so close I could almost hear it breathing. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the tapping resumed, louder now, faster, more insistent. It was as if something on the other side of that wall was demanding to be heard, to be let out. My mind reeled, fragments of what I'd read about Samuel Blackwood piecing together in a horrifying mosaic. Had he heard this same tapping? Had he, too, stood in this very spot, wondering if he should pry open the wall, uncover whatever secret lay hidden within? The thought filled me with a sickening dread, and I stumbled back, my hands shaking. I glanced at the photograph, at the man's dark, knowing eyes. It felt like he was watching, waiting, as if he alone knew the answer to the question I couldn't bring myself to ask. I fled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I leaned against the door, my heart pounding, I realized that I'd opened a door I couldn't close. Whatever was down there, whatever Samuel Blackwood had left behind, it was awake now, and it wasn't going to rest until it had me. The days that followed were marked by an oppressive quiet, as if the house itself were watching me, waiting. Tom noticed my unease but had grown weary of my explanations, so I kept the details to myself, letting the dread settle deep within. Each time I passed the basement door, my stomach knotted, my mind drifting to that incessant tapping, the photograph's dark-eyed gaze. There was something unspoken between the walls, and it felt as though I were the only one who could hear it. On the 5th day, I woke to find the door to the basement open. It stood ajar, a dark maw cutting into the hallway. Tom had left for work, so I was alone, my every instinct urging me to close it, to seal whatever lay beyond it away. Yet, I found myself drawn to the darkness, each step toward it deliberate, as if I had to see for myself that nothing had changed. But as I peered down the stairs, a strange sight met my eyes. The photograph, the one that had been on the box, was now lying at the foot of the stairs, face down, its glass shattered. My heart skipped a beat, my fingers clenching around the banister. It hadn't fallen. It couldn't have. It was as if someone had carried it there and placed it carefully, methodically, as a sign. For a moment, I wondered if Tom might have moved it, trying to prove a point. But no, he wouldn't even go near the basement, convinced that my fears were nothing more than overactive imagination. I took a slow, measured breath and forced myself to descend the stairs, my footsteps muffled against the cold cement floor. As I reached the bottom, the photograph seemed to glare up at me, the man's face blurred beneath the fractured glass. Carefully, I picked it up, brushing away the shards, feeling an odd, almost instinctual need to keep it close. The tapping from the wall had left a deep unease in me, a feeling that something here needed to be unearthed, understood. And now, it was as though the photograph itself was leading me toward that truth, an anchor in a sea of shifting shadows. I set the photograph back on the box and began examining the walls. They were solid stone, unyielding, each surface rough beneath my hands. But then, near the far corner, my fingers brushed against a small indentation, an almost imperceptible seam. My heart raced. I pressed harder, feeling a slight give. I pushed again, and the stone shifted, revealing a narrow crack just wide enough to suggest a hidden space beyond. The air was thick, the silence amplifying the pounding of my heart. I leaned forward, peering into the crack, but it was too dark to see anything. I ran upstairs, grabbed a flashlight, and returned, feeling my nerves fray with every second. As the beam of light sliced through the shadows, I took a steadying breath and pressed my face closer. Inside, there was a hollow, a cramped, shallow space, barely wide enough to fit a few objects. But what I saw sent a chill down my spine. Shelves lined the wall, and on them were small trinkets, relics of another time, layered with dust. Old, yellowed papers, a small child's shoe, a cracked porcelain doll's head, its empty eyes staring blankly into the dark. But that wasn't all. Tucked into the corner, almost hidden from view, was a diary, its cover brittle with age, the binding barely holding together. My hands trembled as I reached in, gingerly pulling it out. As I opened it, the pages crackled beneath my fingers, the faded ink barely legible. The entries were strange, each page filled with rambling confessions, notes scribbled in a frantic, hurried hand. The writer spoke of an unseen presence, of a force that lived within the walls, something that had been left behind, waiting to be acknowledged. The words were desperate, haunted, and a horrifying recognition dawned on me. Samuel Blackwood had written this diary. He had been documenting his encounters, his sleepless nights, the sounds, the movements. He spoke of objects shifting, of shadows that lingered just beyond sight. And as I read, I found my own thoughts mirrored in his words, as if his experience were echoing mine, his fear somehow bleeding into my own. A final entry caught my eye. In it, Samuel had written about the basement, about feeling a compulsion to dig, to unearth something he couldn't explain. He had felt drawn, he wrote, as if something in the foundation of the house held a truth he was destined to find. My fingers hovered over the page, a creeping sense of dread curling around my spine. There was something buried here, something that had waited patiently, biding its time. And now it was reaching out, guiding me, pulling me toward a place that felt darkly familiar, as if it had always been a part of me. I closed the diary and set it back on the shelf, my heart pounding, the weight of its words settling like a stone in my chest. It was as if Samuel's thoughts had intertwined with my own, as if I had unwittingly taken on his fears, his suspicions, his desperate need to understand the darkness that lay beneath. As I stepped back from the wall, I felt a sudden shift in the air, a slight change that set my nerves on edge. The silence grew heavier, the dim light casting long, eerie shadows across the basement floor. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, I heard it again, that relentless, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was a summons, a call that I couldn't ignore. The tapping haunted my thoughts, its beat a steady pulse that wove itself into my mind like a ticking clock I couldn't quiet. Each night I'd lie in bed, eyes wide, waiting for the inevitable. A noise here, a rustle there, the sound of something shifting just beyond my reach. Tom had grown used to my silences, had stopped asking why I looked so distracted, why I spent my evenings listening at the basement door with an expression he could only describe as possessed. But I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. This was something that belonged to me alone now. It was nearly midnight when I finally gathered enough courage to go back down, armed with a heavier flashlight and a crowbar. Though what I planned to do with either, I couldn't say. I descended into the basement, the steps groaning beneath my feet. The air was thick, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to deepen as I stepped further inside, swallowing the small circle of light from my flashlight. My eyes fell on the crack in the wall, the small hidden space with Samuel's diary and the trinkets it contained. But tonight it looked different, like it was waiting for me. The faint tapping seemed to pulse from somewhere just beyond that wall, the rhythm slightly quicker, a heartbeat straining against the confines of stone and dust. I approached it, and for the first time, I felt a strange, almost irrational need to break through, to open it fully, as if some unseen presence were guiding my hands. I pressed the crowbar against the seam, feeling the resistance of stone. The first blow was small, almost tentative, but then the tapping grew louder, urging me on. I struck harder, the noise resounding through the basement, breaking the silence that had sat like a weight on my chest. And finally, with a shudder, a chunk of stone broke away, revealing an opening, just wide enough to fit my hand. Inside, I found another small compartment. My fingers brushed against something soft, brittle. I withdrew it slowly, dusting off what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in cloth, its fabric worn and yellowed with age. My heart raced as I unwrapped it, revealing a handful of items nestled within. The first was a lock of hair, dark and fine, tied neatly with a faded ribbon. Then, a small brass key, tarnished and cold. And finally, a scrap of paper, folded into a tight square, its edges frayed. I held it in my trembling hands, unfolding it slowly, squinting to read the faint, hurried scrawl. "Do not disturb what rests beneath," it read. The words were underlined, each letter heavy, weighted with urgency. A chill washed over me, and I almost dropped the paper. There was something intimate about it, a warning left not for strangers, but for someone who would understand. I tried to picture Samuel writing these words, imagining his desperation, the sense of duty or regret that had driven him to seal this part of the house away. But what had he meant by beneath? Before I could process it further, a sudden noise broke through my thoughts. It was a soft scraping, like nails scratching against stone, coming from the far corner of the basement. I held my breath, straining to hear, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand as I moved toward the sound. The corner was empty, at least at first glance. But then I noticed the faint outline of a trapdoor, hidden beneath a thin layer of dust and debris. It was small, just large enough for a person to fit through, and fitted with a brass ring that gleamed faintly in the flashlight's beam. My pulse quickened as I reached down, gripping the ring and giving it a tug. The trapdoor opened with a groan, revealing a ladder descending into a deeper, darker part of the house. The air that rose up from below was stale, thick with the smell of earth and age. For a moment, I hesitated, a thousand reasons to stop flashing through my mind. But curiosity gnawed at me, pulling me forward, the strange sensation that whatever waited below was a part of my own history, something that had woven itself into my life long before I'd ever stepped into this house. Taking a deep breath, I climbed down, each rung cold and rough beneath my fingers. The darkness seemed to close in as I descended, and when my feet touched solid ground, I felt the weight of the silence pressing against my skin. I swung the flashlight in a slow circle, illuminating the space. A narrow corridor with walls of packed earth, stretching into the shadows. I took a few cautious steps, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. At the end of the corridor, I could just make out a doorway, its frame crooked and splintered. As I approached, the tapping resumed, louder now, like a distant echo pulsing through the ground. Stepping through the doorway, I found myself in a small, cramped room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one stacked with boxes and bundles, papers yellowed and fraying with age. It looked like a forgotten archive, the remnants of lives long past, preserved in this cold, hidden place. I picked up one of the papers, the handwriting faint but unmistakable. It was Samuel's, A letter written in careful, meticulous lines, addressed to someone named Miriam. The letter spoke of regret, of promises broken, of a burden too heavy to bear alone. And then, in the final line, I saw something that made my blood run cold. "Forgive me, but I cannot protect her any longer." I staggered back, the flashlight slipping from my hand. It rolled across the floor, casting wild, erratic beams that threw the room into sharp relief. My mind raced, piecing together fragments, images, memories that felt both foreign and familiar. There was something beneath this house, something that had waited for years, hidden away, its presence woven into the walls, the very foundation. And I was beginning to understand that I was not just an intruder here. I was part of its story, bound to it in ways I hadn't yet begun to fathom. The tapping grew louder, reverberating through the ground, as if answering a question I hadn't dared to ask. The realization that I was part of this house's history settled over me like a fog, leaving me both rooted in place and yearning to escape. As the tapping continued, echoing up from some unseen depth, I felt as though I were standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. The room around me, with its crumbling shelves and ancient papers, seemed to pulse with life, every shadow hiding secrets, every creak of the floorboards carrying whispers of stories left unsaid. I retrieved my flashlight from the ground, the beam quivering as it danced across the shelves and the remnants of lives stored there. Samuel's letter lay where I dropped it, the final words hovering in my mind. I cannot protect her any longer. Who was her? The letter had been addressed to someone named Miriam, but there was no other trace of her here, no photograph, no relic to hint at her story. Only those haunting words, etched into the brittle paper with such finality that it seemed to carry the weight of a curse. Compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity, I moved to the farthest corner of the room, where the tapping felt strongest, almost alive beneath my feet. The ground here was uneven, and as I looked closer, I noticed a faint depression in the dirt, like something buried just beneath the surface. Kneeling down, I reached out to touch it, my fingers grazing the rough earth. Without fully knowing why, I began to dig, my hands pushing away the layers of dust and dirt. My pulse pounded with each handful I removed, and soon I uncovered something hard, something that seemed to resist my touch. It was a small, wooden box, old and fragile, with edges that crumbled as I brushed the dirt away. Lifting it carefully, I felt the tapping intensify, as if the house itself were urging me to open it. Inside, there was a single small object, a ring, silver and tarnished, its once delicate band now twisted and worn. It looked ordinary, almost, but there was a heaviness to it, an undeniable weight that seemed to pulse through my fingers. Beneath the ring was another piece of paper, folded and frayed. I opened it slowly, squinting to make out the faded words, written in Samuel's unmistakable hand. "She is bound to the house. Only through her can it rest." The words chilled me, their meaning obscured yet ominously clear. It was as if Samuel had written it for me, a message that had waited through decades of silence, emerging now as if by some dark, predestined design. She is bound to the house. My mind spun, grasping for explanations, for logic. I had come here looking for answers, for some explanation for the strange disturbances and the pervasive sense of dread that had taken root in our lives. But now, standing there with the ring in my hand, I felt a deeper truth settling over me. This was not about the past, but about the present, about me. The house had chosen me, had wrapped me in its hidden history, its tragedies and secrets. I was not merely an observer here. I was a participant. A sound, faint but unmistakable, broke through the silence. It was not the familiar tapping but a muffled cry, soft and distant, as if carried from a place beyond walls and floors. My breath caught, and for a moment, I stood frozen, straining to hear. The cry came again, faint but unmistakable, a sound filled with sorrow and longing. I turned, the flashlight sweeping across the room, my heart pounding as I realized the sound was coming from above, from somewhere within the house itself. I climbed back up the ladder, my steps hurried, the ring clutched tightly in my hand. The basement seemed to close in around me, as though the house itself were pushing me forward, leading me to where it wanted me to go. The cry grew louder as I ascended, and I followed it instinctively, through the hallway, up the stairs toward the small, unused room at the end of the hall, the one we had avoided, the one that always felt colder, untouched. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, hesitating for just a moment before I turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was empty, its walls bare, the furniture sparse and untouched, but the air was thick, almost alive, and I felt the weight of something intangible pressing down on me, filling the space. I closed the door behind me, and as I stood there, the faint cry came again, so close now that I could feel it in my bones. I held the ring tightly, its metal cool against my skin, and for a moment, I closed my eyes, allowing myself to feel whatever was present here, to surrender to the strange sense of connection that had woven itself around me since we'd arrived. Then, slowly, I opened my eyes, and there, in the dim light of the room, I saw her. She was faint, almost translucent, a figure draped in shadows, her form shifting and insubstantial. But her face, her eyes, they were clear, vivid, filled with a sorrow so deep that it seemed to spill over, filling the room with a silent, endless ache. She looked at me, and in that moment, I understood who she was. Miriam, I whispered, the name slipping from my lips as if it had been waiting there all along. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her gaze held mine, and I felt a strange, desperate need to help her, to ease the suffering etched into her features. The ring in my hand grew colder, and instinctively, I knew what I had to do. Slowly, I held it out, offering it to her, a gesture of surrender, of understanding. Her form wavered, her hand reaching out, fingers brushing the ring in a motion that felt as delicate and tentative as a heartbeat. And then, as her fingers closed around it, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the air, the sorrow lifting like a fog. The room grew still, the air lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from its very walls. I stood there alone, the silence settling around me, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace, a quietness that seemed to fill every corner of the house. For days after that encounter in the unused room, the house seemed almost too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. The atmosphere, once charged with strange echoes and unsettling murmurs, had transformed into an almost unnatural stillness. Each room I entered seemed frozen in time, waiting, but the stillness did not bring the comfort I'd hoped for. Rather, it filled me with a new sort of dread, the kind that comes from uncertainty and silence. I no longer felt watched, but something about the house seemed incomplete, as if an answer lay hidden just beyond my reach. I couldn't shake the sensation that Miriam had left something unfinished. I tried to tell my husband about the woman in the unused room, the sorrow in her eyes, and the strange feeling that she had somehow found peace by taking the ring. I wanted to confide everything: the tapping in the basement, the letters from Samuel, and the connection I felt between myself and this woman I had never met. But whenever I started to speak, words seemed to fail me. How could I explain what I barely understood myself? My husband listened, his face gentle, his brow furrowing with concern as I fumbled through the story. He assured me that we could leave the house, sell it if I wanted, that our happiness and peace of mind were far more important than anything else. I appreciated his offer, but deep down, I knew that leaving wouldn't erase the pull I felt toward the house. It was as if Miriam had passed something on to me in that final moment, a burden or a truth that I was now bound to uncover. One evening, after another day of uneasy silence, I found myself drawn back to the basement. The old room at the end of the hall now lay empty, abandoned again, and yet I couldn't let go of the feeling that Miriam had left behind more than a sense of peace. There was a compulsion in me, a strange need to revisit every corner of this house as though it would reveal its secrets if I looked hard enough. The basement was darker than I remembered, and the air hung thickly, layered with the scent of age and decay. The single light bulb flickered, casting a dim glow over the dust and shadows. The shelves that had once seemed only cluttered now appeared charged with something unspoken, as though each item held a fragment of the lives that had passed through this house. I returned to the corner where I'd found the ring, crouching down to examine the spot in the dirt. A faint indentation marked where the box had lain, and as I ran my hand over it, I felt a small, hard object beneath the surface. Digging my fingers into the dirt, I uncovered another trinket. This time, a small brass key, tarnished and slightly bent. It felt strangely warm in my hand, its surface smooth and worn, as though it had been held by countless hands before mine. For a moment, I simply held the key, feeling its weight, wondering what secrets it had locked away. Then, almost as if driven by instinct, I began searching the basement, running my fingers along the walls, over the shelves, trying every drawer and cabinet for a place where the key might fit. After what felt like hours, I almost gave up, but a small door at the back of the room caught my eye. I had overlooked it before, thinking it was only a crawl space or storage area, its handle covered in rust, almost hidden by the shadows. Kneeling down, I inserted the brass key, feeling a strange sense of anticipation wash over me. With a click, the lock turned, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairway descending into an even deeper darkness. I hesitated, the weight of the house pressing down on me, but something compelled me forward, a force beyond fear or curiosity. As I stepped onto the staircase, a cool draft hit me, carrying with it a scent I couldn't quite place. A mix of damp earth and something faintly metallic, like old coins or rusted iron. I gripped the banister tightly, feeling its rough wood beneath my fingers as I descended. The stairs led to a small room, almost like a hidden cellar. It was cramped, the ceiling low, and my flashlight barely illuminated the shadows that clung to every corner. There were more shelves here, but unlike the ones upstairs, these held nothing but dust and cobwebs, as though untouched for years. In the center of the room lay a single object, a small wooden chest, old and cracked, its once polished surface now dull and marred by time. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside, I found a collection of letters, each one carefully folded, some tied together with faded ribbons. They were addressed to Miriam, written in the same spidery script as the notes I had found before. My hands shook as I picked one up, feeling as though I were intruding on something sacred, a relic of a life long past. Unfolding the first letter, I began to read, my heart pounding as the words sank in. It was from Samuel, his tone no longer affectionate or concerned, but strained, almost desperate. He spoke of voices in the night, of strange apparitions that appeared in the corners of his vision, lingering only long enough to remind him of his isolation. He wrote of his struggle to keep Miriam safe, and his growing fear that she was slipping away, that the spirit haunting the house was taking something from her, piece by piece. "I fear that the house has claimed her," he wrote, the words trembling on the page. "It has taken her spirit and left only a shell, a hollow vessel that no longer knows itself." I read on, each letter revealing a deeper descent into anguish and despair. Samuel's words grew darker, filled with regret and a sense of helplessness, as though he had become trapped in the very thing he had sought to protect her from. His final letter ended abruptly, a single line written in a hurried scrawl. "She is bound to the house, and so am I." The letters fell from my hands, the pages scattering across the floor. I sat back, my mind reeling as I pieced together the story. The tragic bond that had held Samuel and Miriam to this place, trapped in a cycle of fear and loss. They had been bound here, their lives woven into the fabric of the house itself. And now, it seemed, they had drawn me into that same web. I wanted to scream, to run, to shake off the weight of their sorrow and escape this house that had absorbed so much suffering. But as I rose to my feet, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a realization that had been simmering just beneath the surface. This house was more than wood and stone, more than bricks and mortar. It was a vessel, a keeper of memories, a silent witness to lives lost and stories forgotten. And somehow, it had chosen me, drawn me into its depths to uncover the secrets that had lain dormant for so long. With a final glance at the scattered letters, I turned and made my way back up the stairs, leaving the hidden room behind. The house was silent once more, but it no longer felt empty. The presence of Samuel and Miriam lingered, not as shadows or whispers, but as a quiet knowledge, a reminder of the lives they had lived and the sacrifices they had made. I closed the door behind me, locking it with the brass key, and as I climbed the steps back to the main floor, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The house, it seemed, had given me its blessing, entrusted me with its secrets. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one more truth to uncover, a final mystery that lay just beyond my reach, waiting patiently for me to find it. The days following my discovery in the basement felt strangely calm, but this newfound quiet was laced with an undercurrent I couldn't name. The house itself seemed to exhale, as though relieved that some long-buried truth had finally seen light. Still, I knew that whatever peace I'd found was fragile, as delicate as the letters I'd left scattered in the hidden cellar. I spent each day drifting through the rooms, absorbing every creak and shadow, and for the first time since we'd moved in, I felt as though the house was almost listening. But the nights held a different quality altogether. It began as a subtle rhythm, an intermittent tapping sound, not unlike a heartbeat pulsing softly against the walls. I heard it first while lying awake in bed, and I strained to place its source. Unlike the echoes and whispers I'd grown used to, this was deliberate and slow, like a presence settling into the quiet of the night. I held my breath, willing the sound to stop, but it seemed to grow louder, closer, until I felt it in the very walls around me. The next day, I examined every inch of the house, but no loose boards or pipes could account for the sound. I even asked my husband if he'd heard it, but he only looked at me with a gentle, weary smile as though humoring me. The house has its quirks. Love. Old wood settles, you know. Perhaps he was right. But when the tapping returned that night, I knew it was no ordinary sound. This time, it seemed to follow me, growing louder as I moved through the hallways in the dark, reverberating from beneath my feet. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing more than the groaning of an old house. But as I stood alone in the dim light of the staircase, a single word drifted through my mind, unbidden and chilling: summons. It was as if the house itself were calling to me, inviting me deeper into its secrets. Unable to resist, I found myself drawn back to the basement door. With a hand that barely felt like my own, I unlocked it and stepped into the cool darkness below. Each step I took seemed to echo, filling the silence with a strange, rhythmic resonance that matched the tapping I'd heard above. In the dim glow of my flashlight, I returned to the small, concealed door at the back of the room, the one I had opened only once. It looked innocent now, a simple wooden panel worn with age. But I sensed that there was something I had missed, some part of the house's story I had yet to uncover. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open once more. The hidden cellar lay before me, its small chest still in the center of the room, the letters scattered around it like a broken promise. I picked up one of the pages, its corners yellowed and delicate, and began reading, letting Samuel's words guide me once more. His writing was erratic, filled with strange phrases and warnings that left me uneasy. The words "bound to this place" appeared over and over, as if he'd been pleading, not with Miriam, but with some unseen force that held them both. There were lines about visions, shadows that flickered in the corners of his eyes, and moments where he swore he could hear voices whispering his name. The intensity of his desperation made me shiver, but it was the final letter that left me truly shaken. It was a short note, barely a paragraph, written hastily, as though he hadn't had time to finish. Samuel wrote of seeing Miriam one last time in the room at the top of the stairs, a place he called the meeting ground. There, he claimed, he had glimpsed her as she truly was, a figure of light and shadow, neither fully alive nor fully gone. He wrote that she had tried to speak to him, but her voice was like the sound of rain on stone, a language he could not understand. As I held the letter in my hands, I felt a strange compulsion to find this place he had mentioned, the meeting ground. It wasn't a term I'd heard before, and I wondered if it was simply his way of describing a memory, a space of intimacy within their shared life. But something about the phrasing seemed deliberate, as though he had meant it in the most literal sense. I left the basement and returned to the main floor, feeling a strange clarity settle over me. The house guided my steps as I wandered through its corridors, my fingers trailing along the walls, feeling their familiar roughness beneath my touch. Each room seemed to hold its breath as I passed, waiting, watching. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and then to the attic, a narrow staircase that led up to a small, forgotten room at the top of the house. The attic was quiet, filled with dust and the faint scent of dried wood. The room was empty, save for an old chair and a window that looked out over the backyard. Sunlight filtered through the dusty glass, casting a warm glow over the floor. It was a simple, unremarkable space, and yet I knew with an unsettling certainty that this was the place Samuel had described. I stood there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence, waiting for some sign or signal. The air grew thick around me, and the weight of the room pressed down on my shoulders, heavy and almost suffocating. My pulse quickened as I felt a presence gathering, an unseen force that filled the space with a subtle, quiet energy. It was then that I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like the sound of fabric moving against skin. I looked around, my eyes straining against the dim light, but there was no one there. Still, the sound continued, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to surround me, filling every corner of the room. And then I saw her. She appeared not as a ghostly apparition, but as a faint, shimmering outline, barely visible in the half-light. Her face was turned away from me, her gaze fixed on something beyond my understanding. She stood silently, her form wavering like mist, fragile and delicate, yet somehow powerful in its stillness. I felt a strange sense of recognition, as though I were seeing a part of myself reflected back at me, a piece of my own past that had been hidden away. Miriam, I whispered, the name slipping from my lips before I could stop it. At the sound of her name, the figure turned to face me, her expression serene, almost peaceful. Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I understood the truth of what had drawn her here, what had bound her to this place. She was more than a memory, more than a spirit. She was a part of the house itself, a piece of its story that could not be erased. As she gazed at me, I felt a strange warmth fill my chest, a sense of acceptance, of belonging. I realized that I was not here to exorcise or banish her presence, but to embrace it, to allow her story to live on through me. The house had chosen me, not as its captive, but as its keeper, its witness. Slowly, the figure faded, her form dissolving into the light that filled the room. I watched her go, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief, as though I were saying goodbye to an old friend. The silence returned, wrapping itself around me like a comforting shroud, and I knew that I had finally found peace, not just for myself, but for Miriam as well. I left the attic, closing the door behind me, and descended the stairs, my heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The house no longer felt like a prison or a burden, but like a part of me, a place where the past and present could coexist in quiet harmony. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet resolution that settled over me like a warm embrace. The house, it seemed, had given me its blessing, entrusted me with its secrets, and I knew that I would carry them with me for the rest of my life. But as I crossed the threshold, a single question lingered in my mind, a question that would haunt me for years to come. Was I the last keeper of the house's secrets, or merely the latest in a long line of silent witnesses?